They say Rome was built with stone and sword, but that is only half the truth. The rest of it, the pulsing heart of empire, was cooked, carved, and consumed in silence behind marble doors. You wouldn't last a single meal in ancient Rome, not because the food was spoiled or strange, but because every bite carried a curse. If you were lucky enough, or perhaps cursed enough, to be invited to dine with you'd first pass through corridors perfumed with crushed flowers and blood. Beneath your sandals, the tiles would glisten with scenes of myth. Gods punishing men for arrogance, heroes feasting with monsters, beasts eating their own young. The art was no accident, it was prophecy. You'd be led by silent slaves, faces powdered white to hide the bruises. They'd lower their eyes, not out of respect but fear. Not for you, of course, for the food, for what it meant. The dining room would open like a trap, its walls lined with gold leaf vines and painted illusions. The triclinium, 3 long couches, arranged so each guest must recline on their side, elbow pressing against velvet cushions, neck exposed, always exposed. You would take your place, you would try to smile, but nothing in that room was soft. Not really. The marble bit through the silk, the wine tasted like fire, the laughter curled like smoke. The host would appear last, his robe dyed with Tyrian purpleworth, more than your life, and his eyes would scan the room like a butcher at market. One nod, and the first course would arrive. At first, it would seem lavish. Peacock roasted with dates and pine nuts, oysters still twitching in their shells, dormice plumped with figs and herbs until their bodies split. You'd think it strange, perhaps decadent, but survivable, until you tasted it. There was something bitter under the sweetness, a powder on your tongue, a heat that did not come from fire. They would tell you it was saffron or cumin, but you would see the servant who brought the plate shiver after placing it down. He had tasted it once. He had no tongue now. Conversation would bloom like rot. Senators would whisper of conspiracies while licking grease from their fingers. Poets would recite lines about death while gnawing on goat brain. A general would boast of burying 300 men alive as he sucked the marrow from a lamb's spine. They would speak of cruelty like vintages of wine. You'd feel your stomach turn, not from hunger, but recognition. These were not men. These were remnants, wraiths of empire, feeding on memory, dressing their crimes in pastry and gold. And then someone would mention the surprise. The host would smile. The guests would hush. Another course would arrive. It would look like a pie, steaming, fragrant, but inside lived birds, starved and blinded, released at the slice to flutter and scream into the chandeliers. A moment of chaos, the illusion of freedom. Laughter would return, thick and slow. Someone would toast to the gods, but the gods had already turned away. You would try not to choke as the feathers brushed your face, as the scent of blood and roasted fruit tangled in your breath. But the feast had shifted. The air grew heavier, as if the walls themselves were exhaling something ancient and sour. Now came the meats they did not name. Sausages twisted from organs you could not place. Marinated tongues curled beside still-beating fish hearts. Dishes that hissed and twitched as though resisting digestion. The laughter dulled into murmurs, not because the guests were afraid, but because they were remembering. Each dish was a story, a sin preserved in salt. You would notice that no one ate with joy. They ate with reverence, or habit, or defiance. A senator beside you would stare into his bowl of blackened olives and mutter something in Greek, something about the underworld. His fingers shook. You would look down and realize your plate had been changed without you noticing. Now it held a single eye, suspended in jelly, staring back. Not human. Probably, the host would rise again, his voice silk-soaked in vinegar, and announce the next course as a tribute to victory. Slaves would enter carrying a whole sow, pregnant and roasted. Her belly sliced open to reveal a dozen songbirds baked inside her womb. Their beaks glistened with honey and ash. The host would offer you the first bite. You'd hesitate. You'd die inside. And you'd say yes, because Rome didn't ask it waited. You'd chew on the tiny, brittle bones, and no one would speak. The silence would be ceremonial. Across the room, someone would begin to cry. Not loudly, just a whimper, broken by clinking glass. The poet, perhaps, or the widow of a disgraced consul. She would weep into a soup until a slave stepped forward and gently covered her mouth with a napkin. The others would pretend not to see. You would pretend you still had an appetite. Between courses, entertainment arrived. Not music, not dancing. That was for the common people. For patricians, pleasure was pain observed. A boy with oiled skin and hollow eyes was brought in on a silver platter, curled like a shrimp, body painted in gold leaf. The host explained that he could recite every emperor's dying words backwards. He did, trembling. When he failed on Caligula, someone threw a bone. It struck his shoulder. No one moved to help. You would look away, but the host would catch your eye and smile. You'd understand. Finally, this was not a dinner. It was a proving ground. Every gesture was a ritual. Every bite was a test, and the worst was yet to come. A soldier near the end of the table would ask for something raw. It was not a joke. The slaves moved faster now, their faces blank as statues, their hands steady as surgeons. They brought him a plate of liver steaming red, barely dead. No one asked where it came from. That was the point. He ate it with his fingers. Blood dripped into his wine. He licked both, and the room applauded. You would feel the tremor in your hands grow stronger. And still, they would pour more wine. Still, they would serve dates soaked in mercury and figs filled with live ants. And still, the host would smile, not because he was enjoying the food, but because you hadn't yet run. At this point, you would stop feeling hungry, not because you were full, but because hunger had been replaced by something darker, something that nestled behind your ribs like a parasite. The feast had drained you, not just of appetite, but of innocence. Still, the courses marched on like legions. Bread soaked in ox blood, pickled jellyfish, goat lungs baked inside a cow's womb, then sprinkled with powdered pearls. The guests no longer spoke with words. Their sounds were moans, low laughter, a kind of chewing rhythm that pulsed like a chant. You would look around and notice how few still made eye contact. They were turning inward, folding into their own decay. The slaves moved differently now, faster, more mechanical, as if guided not by command but by possession. One dropped a tray. No one reacted, not even the host. The slave simply picked up the shards and sliced his palm on purpose, a punishment delivered by his own hand. You saw him tuck the broken piece into his belt, for later, a memory, or perhaps an escape. Then came the course that was not spoken aloud. No one described it. It was simply brought forward, covered in silk, and placed at the center of the table like a newborn. The cloth was lifted. Beneath it, a sculpture of flesh. You couldn't tell where it began or ended. Pheasant monkey, infant pig, human. Its skin glistened. Its eyes had been replaced by grapes. His mouth was open. Inside, pearls and teeth that didn't belong. A senator reached forward and carved it without question. Others followed. No one asked what it was. That was the point. Rome had moved beyond naming. They consumed the nameless because the nameless could not accuse. You would not eat not this time. Your hands would tremble. Your mouth would dry, but the host would notice. He would lean close. He would whisper, "We only eat what we've conquered. Are you not victorious?" And the room would wait. You'd feel every breath in the air stop. Not eating would make you visible, and in Rome, to be visible was to be vulnerable. You would take a piece, you would bite, and inside, it would be sweet. Sickeningly sweet. Honey and marrow and rot. The host would lean back, satisfied, and the feast would continue. There was no natural end, only a slow unraveling. The oil lamps began to flicker. The guests sweated beneath their jewels. One woman began to giggle uncontrollably. She covered her mouth, but could not stop. Her teeth were stained red. When she coughed, something black landed in her palm. She stared at it, then swallowed it. The host clapped once. From behind a curtain, a procession of animals entered the room. Not Dee live, deer shaved and painted, a lioness chained and drugged, a goat with gilded horns. They were gifts, or metaphors, or reminders. Each guest approached and whispered something to one of them. Ritual, confession, you didn't know. When your turn came, you stepped before the lioness. Her eyes were wide and lucid. She did not blink. He said nothing. She did not move. And yet, he felt judged. Later, the room darkened further. Candles were doused. Torches flickered. Someone began to sing a slow, nasal hymn in a tongue you didn't understand. The host removed his robe. Beneath it, his skin was covered in tattoos. Names, dates, symbols. One was still fresh, bleeding. He knelt and placed his head on the floor. The others followed. A feast turned to worship. A sacrifice of form. A surrender of meaning. You did not know if this was the end or the beginning, but the food kept coming. At some point, the idea of time vanished. You could no longer tell if minutes had passed, or if centuries had collapsed into this one room. What you did notice was the silence, not absence of sound, but the arrival of a deeper kind of quiet, one that crawled across the skin like cold breath. The feast had become a mausoleum. Bodies remained seated, but no longer moved. Their eyes rolled behind half-closed lids. One senator had fallen forward, mouth still chewing, though nothing remained inside. He did not blink. He was not dead. He was simply complete. From the corner, the sound of bones clinking in a silver bowl. A boy entered, no older than 10, barefoot, eyes rimmed in kohl. He carried the bowl without trembling. Inside it, tongues, human, animal, impossible to tell. He moved from guest to guest. Some reached in without question. Others looked away. When the bowl came to you, you froze. The boy said nothing, just stared. His stare was not cruel. It was ancient. He had seen too many things to care if he wept. Behind him, the host now wore a mask of very white. Expressionless, he stood, arms outstretched. The gods do not hunger for bread, he declared. They hunger for memory, for obedience, for the flesh of those who refuse. Then he turned his mask to you. Have you refused? You felt your knees buckle. Everyone watched, yet no one helped. In Rome, help was humiliation, and mercy. Mercy was the most offensive gesture of all. The boy set the bowl at your feet. You reached in. The tongue you picked was still warm, and just before you placed it in your mouth, you heard a sound, not from within but from the floor. Beneath the marble, a dull thud. Then another, as if something below had awakened. Some guests began to chant, others rocked gently. The lights dimmed further. Someone screamed, but not from pain, from knowing, a deep, ancient knowing that they could no longer leave. You understood then. This was not a meal. It was a rite, a passage, not into adulthood or pleasure but into Rome itself, into its true nature, which had been hidden beneath marble and poetry and aqueducts. The hunger of the empire was not for land, but for the soul, for domination that reached past death. The feast was never about eating. It was about transformation. The food reshaped you. The silence rewired you. You would never think the same again. And when the meal ended not with a toast, but with the extinguishing of flame, you found yourself outside, somehow in the cold. Your hands were red. Your lips tasted of copper. The stars above looked unfamiliar. And in your gut, something moved. A slow, curling sensation. Not sickness, not digestion, but memory. Someone else's memory. The memory of every guest before you. Their choices, their surrender, their ecstasy and regret. And that, perhaps, was the final course. Not the food but what it left behind. The ghost of appetite, the echo of empire, and the certainty that Rome did not eat to survive. It consumed to erase, to convert, to conquer in silence. As you walked away, you realized the worst thing wasn't what you had tasted. It was what you now craved. And somewhere, far below the ground where slaves once buried their pain in secret tunnels, something opened its eyes.